Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to God's glory and that of his kingdom. We are looking at a world in which the threats to friends and allies of ours, and indeed, I would argue, to our own assets and personnel and perhaps territory, from the Chinese Communist Party continues to grow, seemingly by the day. The Taiwanese have been subjected to now incessant incursions of their airspace and maritime maneuvers that are threatening, as well as a lot of bellicose rhetoric, notably at the recent Shangri La dialogue, where a general by the name of Wei held forth about crushing anyone who stood in the way of China's domination of Taiwan. And we always want to get sort of ground truth about what is happening at the moment and what is in prospect. And we know of no one better to provide the ground truth than our colleague and friend at the Center for Security Policy. It's Senior Fellow Grant Newsham. He is also a Senior Fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies at the Yorktown Institute, a man of many parts, former Marine colonel, now retired, former Foreign Service officer, an attorney by training, a man who has done handsomely as a businessman in the Western Pacific, and just a terrific resource for us here at Securing America when it comes to matters involving our national security and that of the region. Welcome back, Colonel. It's good to have you with us, sir.
No, thanks very much. Glad to be here.
I want to start with a very interesting piece that another of our friends and colleagues, Gordon Chang, wrote for the Gatestone Institute the past day or so, in which he talks about an angle in the calculations of the Chinese about aggression against Taiwan that I wanted to sound you out about. It basically, his thesis is that Taiwan's missile capabilities and their range, which is, he says, sufficient to reach both Beijing and the Three Gorges Dam, can add a very important deterrence calculation to the Chinese, even in the absence of nuclear warheads aboard such missiles. Give us your sense of all of that, if you would, Colonel.
Well, it's certainly part of the equation when you think about Taiwan's defense or when Taiwan thinks about its own defense. Does it just want to sit back and try to knock off Chinese ships and aircraft that come across the Taiwan Strait? Or does it want to be able to hit back into Chinese mainland and hit targets that cause really disproportionate damage? And you can bet the Taiwanese have thought about that. It's a capability that they just might want to have. Whether or not they have it, of course, is debatable. But it's part of the equation. And it's sort of an active offense, an active defense, is how you would put it. Think of it from China's perspective. They would love to be able to just steamroll Taiwan, get it at relatively little cost. But what if they can't? What if Taiwan makes itself into like the equivalent of an electric fence? You get a big cow that doesn't want, it can pull through it if it wanted, but touches that fence and just doesn't want to. And that's what we're talking about here.
So, attacks on targets in Beijing would presumably involve government facilities of various kinds. Talk us through the idea of an attack against this massive dam called the Three Gorges Dam. What would that entail if the Taiwanese were able to exercise an option to attack it successfully?
Well, it requires weapons with the range and with the explosive power to bring down a dam. And that, in some respects, it's a technical question, one of being able to deliver it and with enough force. Bringing down a dam, if it's the right one, that can really cause some disruption. And keep in mind that the Chinese Communist party, the communist leadership, they will sacrifice millions of Taiwanese, of Chinese, well, Taiwanese too,
mm,
but
mm,
Chinese in particular. They've shown themselves willing to do that. They've killed 50 million of their own people since
yes.
taking over, and that was in peacetime and in good weather. So they will sacrifice a lot of people. But it makes you look pretty incompetent if a major, say, the Three Gorges Dam is brought down and tens of millions of people are killed, and a
Mm,
lot more affected, because the Chinese Communist Party does make a big deal of its supposed omniscience and sort of all power. And it's this ability to rule China. And if you can't protect your dams like that and other key targets, well, what does it look like? And that might
mm,
be something that the long suffering Chinese people will not put up with.
mm. I think Gordon, in his essay, talks about 400 million Chinese being downstream from that dam. And you've made the distinction perhaps between people who would be swept away, killed in huge numbers, and those that would be impacted over time as a result of the loss of power on the one hand, and the water that would be everywhere downstream for quite some time. Um, and I guess this does go to the question of the legitimacy of the regime in Beijing, whether it could, in fact, sustain that kind of damage. Um, to both their authority as well as their control of the population. And to the extent that, again, these are calculations that have to be factored in as one thinks about the likelihood of being able, for example, by a Chinese preemptive attack, to take out such missiles as the Taiwanese may have, and otherwise defend against, whatever remnants manage to get through to get near the dam. Do you have any sense, Colonel, as to the actual credence that the Chinese Communist Party would give to these kinds of capabilities being in Taiwanese hands at the moment?
Well, I think they'd be worried. They've got obviously they've had 50 years to get spies and assets into place in Taiwan, so they would have some idea of what Taiwanese capabilities are. I think you have to recognize that. But at the same time, what if you're wrong? And that's something that they do have to factor in. Also, an attack on mainland targets like this, of course, it takes place in a broader context, and that's of a sort of an assault on Taiwan. So, if the Taiwanese have this sort of more complex defense that is causing China's conventional forces huge problems, that an attack on the mainland is part of that sort of hit that China's taking. China's it's facing huge sanctions. It's losing all of its overseas assets. It's lost. Even the Americans have gotten involved in this somehow. A good chunk of the Chinese Navy is at the bottom of the ocean. That you say it's not just one thing. It's rare that one attack will actually bring an opponent down. But having this capability is something that they do have to think about, just in the same way, say, if suppose, and I'm just using it as a as an example, suppose we fought Mexico and they could knock down three of our biggest dams. We would, it's Mexico. We outweigh them in every respect. But if they could, you can hit into your opponent's sort of rear areas. It makes them take you a lot more seriously. Think of that
Yes.
electric fence.
It's a
That you
very, very key point. Colonel, we have to pause for just a second. When we come back, I want to ask you one more question about Taiwan, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the other factors in the region that hopefully will further deter the Chinese Communist Party and its malign intent towards
Sure.
Taiwan. That and more with Colonel Grant Newsham right after this.